All right, everybody. Welcome to Flow Conversations. Maybe we should have a separate host every week. We'll figure that out. But I jumped in for this week, and the topic is health checks. So the first question that came to mind for me was, what do health checks have to do with flow?
That's a good question, but it comes back to, from a starting point, where do you see the role of people in an organization? And if the role of people is to do wonderful things and work together in wonderful ways, then they are the enablers of flow in a strange kind of way. So that's like the link, I think. But
so the health of people, that's a good point.
To tie into like our mini agenda here is it can be health of people, but there's also other ways to look at health checks. And so we wanted to like talk about what is health and why would you check it. And so Saeed, do you want to start us off with your take on that?
So I think we use the word health check a lot, and I think the first question is, what does health mean? And one of the problems is that oftentimes people don't define what health is before they start doing a health check, meaning that what exactly are we measuring and why? Then what will those measurements tell us, right? And if you think about a physical health check, right? So you go to the doctor and they give you a blood test or something like that. Like, they know fairly well what they're expecting. And if something is not within the expected range or whatever, then it's an indicator of some other problem. And then they can decide how to intervene or whatever to do next. So I think with people or with processes or products or whatever you want to measure in business, I think it's important to understand what health means in that context and why it's important. And then you can do health checks and interventions and other things once you understand that.
So Shaaron, do you want to talk about health from the people side of you then?
Yeah, so I really like what you started with, Steve, by the way, that relationship between your health checks and flow. I'd love to come back to it. And but to rebound on what you said, Saeed, one of the reasons why health checks might be more appealing, to teams is also because it's not just about measuring and monitoring performance. It's when we talk about health, when we are healthy, we're also happy, right? We also work better together. We are happier. Mm-hmm. There's also that well-being aspect that comes with doing health checks that works better than just monitoring through reporting, metrics, KPI, and so on. So
yeah, agreed. I wasn't implying there's only one way to do it. All I was saying is that it should be done with clarity and with sort of a deliberate intent, right? As opposed to saying, let's do a health check. Okay, what do we want to measure? Well, that's the wrong answer, right? You don't start with what you want to measure. You want to say, let's understand what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve, and what does health mean? Like, what does a healthy team mean? What does healthy process mean? And then work backwards from there.
Right. And when you say what does health mean? The way I run it is what does it mean for that respective team? And you talked about context, which is great, right? So because a lot of the health checks that you can see readily available are often based on criteria that were collected, based on industry practices, best practices, and so on. And so I think that can be a start. We can use them as a start, but what's really important is to go back to the reality of the team, their context, where they are in their journey, and ask them, what does a healthy team mean to you? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I always cringe when I hear people ask, well, what did you do at this company? Or how did someone else do it? And it's like, well, they did what they did, and they did it for the situation they were in, right? The most famous example is the whole Spotify model. Well, if it worked for Spotify, then it probably should work for everyone, right? And then later on, it comes out that even Spotify said, hey, we don't even do the Spotify model. So I think people should look what they're trying to achieve, look in their context, and like you said, the maturity, the capability, the objectives, and then make some decisions. And one of the things about metrics, or not metrics, I shouldn't use that word. One of the things about when you try and measure things or you try and assess things is start simple, and then once you learn more, build over time, right? Once you understand what healthy means, then it becomes easier to look at health. But it's never a static situation because you're changing over time as well.
Right. And here I want to go back to what you started us off with, Steve, actually. You said, Said, when we talk about metrics or even health, right, health check, we can start up with a problem that we have and work around that problem. And I like Mark Schwartz's approach, actually, to measuring teams' health and performance. You actually recommended to start with some of the aspects that are the most challenging within a team. And in fact, he suggested so what does health check has to do is it also has to do with the experience of the developers' productivity, and it's tied with flow, right? We want to enable developers and teams to be productive, to have less interruption, as little interruption as possible. So, and we can accomplish that with empowered self-check. So I think there's definitely a tie between developer experience, productivity, flow, and health checks.
I think there's a piece there around resilience too. If we understand the health, we can understand the resilience of the system. And if we understand the resilience of the system, that in turn helps us understand from a flow perspective whether it can be resistant to flow. If there are disruptions, are we capable of absorbing change? Are we in good health? Are we able to continue to operate as we move forward?
From the perspective of having human beings, like every organization has human beings, and all human beings have similar, like it's not the same as an organization's culture is different from one to another. Human beings tend to be relatively similar across the spectrum. But one of the things that we're not great at is having a inbred culture of continuous improvement. And so what a health check enables you to do is to set an example of here's one tiny facet of what a culture of continuous improvement could look like inside of a team. So a team, let's take it like from to kind of come off of Spotify's health check team squad health check was the model that I started with. So it was like, oh, hey, they've thought this through and they have the template, and I'll just stand on the shoulders of giants kind of thing. And so we tried it, and what you ended up getting out of it was you start having conversations with people, you build relationships inside of the team, which builds that on that well-being component that Shaaron mentioned. And then you push them to say, hey, can we make this better? What could it look like if we made it better? And themselves having identified their own issues, you can have them target any kind of action they want to take out of it. And if you don't get any action out of it, that's a signal. Like lack of action is a signal that others outside of the team can see. And so that aspect of it is a type of continuous improvement that can tend to be a good motivator moving forward.
One challenge that I find with concept of health checks and a pattern that people fall into is this idea that healthy is kind of an arbitrary target, right? It's an end state. It's very much the same problem that we have with maturity models. So you can define health and head towards it. And what it occurs to me is the goal really is healthier, right? Like and healthier is very tailored. It's very relative to any given team. And it starts with an awareness of the current state, and then a focus on what would be the most valuable improvement to the health of this team, rather than how do we get towards this unified sort of finish line where any number of specific measures could be advanced, but who knows which one is going to have the greatest effect, the most positive impact, especially the soonest and with the least amount of impact. but I've seen Adam sort of furrowing his brow this whole time. I know he's got thoughts on a lot of stuff. I want to bring him in if he's got anything to add.
No, I think part of the thing with the health checks is this might be like one of the few cases where I don't actually see the goal to become healthier, in the sense of we like to talk about continuous improvement and, trying to like reach these sort of asymptotes of progress. But for me, when I think of these health checks, it's more like how do we measure that? And then what is the objective? And then when we see things going in one direction, what are the signs that we use to change our behavior such that we move closer to this defined state of what healthy is? So like, yes, you might be going between, say, I am unhealthy, so I need to become healthier to a point, and then that's sort of like the stable state. So for me, the health check is more like, how do we define this stable state for like our team or our flow or sort of, a bunch of different things? And then what are the measurements we use to set the guardrails for us when we start to go in a different direction?
I think that ties into what we wanted to address, right? How do we get started? And I think there's a lot of, we can start off with something that already exists, but we have to make sure that we customize it, we run it by the team, we look at it, we ask questions, we identify criteria that are valid for our team, right? And so there's a lot of planning that needs to happen before we start a health check, and a lot of planning, a lot of design to do actually with the team, collaboration with the team. And that's the aspect that I like the most probably about the health checks. It's not an oversight from managers, leaders, who ask us to, look at some metrics in particular because those metrics are the trend, or those are not. We're not looking at lagging indicators. We're really looking at leading indicators that are defined, identified by the team, and again, based on where they are in their journey, what their constraints are. So there's different ways we can start with that as well. I remember an interview I did with Nicole Forsgren, and she mentioned that some teams use the 4 matrix, the DORA 4 matrix, as a sort of a health check or improvement roadmap. They start off of those metrics and they ask themselves, how can we be in a situation where we can measure those metrics, and how can we get better at meeting a high performance team actually. But they base their health check and their maturity road, or their journey, I want to say, I don't like to use maturity. They base it on those DORA metrics. So I think there are different models, but it's a conversation that needs to happen with the team. And I think that's a really good, that's a huge advantage and benefit of health checks versus, measuring metrics, keeping reporting and so on.
So I'll say this, I think, and not to be the broken record, but I think this is why it's really important to define health and understand why you are measuring it. And I agree with Adam in the sense that the way I look at health checks is, what is something wrong? So, you're like, generally speaking, and I don't want to use too many medical analogies, but generally speaking, we don't think of health checks when everything is great and we want to get better. We think of health checks when something isn't right. And we get some signals, oh, I'm feeling, my blood pressure's high or something. And so then we kind of want to diagnose what the problem might be and then figure out how to address it. And to me, the goal of the health check is to make sure that you catch these things early, you address them, and you get back to some reasonably good state, right? And then the opposite of that, in a way, is how do you improve? And I think that's a very different concept, because it's not that anything particular is wrong, but we want to get better. So we see areas where we can improve, but that doesn't mean that there's a problem that we're starting with. And the two can overlap. So it's not that they're 100% orthogonal to each other, but I do think that the definition is important, because what I've seen is health checks suffer from scope creep. And people are like, well, we can do this. Oh, now we'll do that. And all of a sudden the health check is not a health check. It's something completely different.
And it's interesting to jump in here because I was thinking about the measurement. It's where I struggle the most when looking at health checks, and I agree completely with you, Saeed and Adam, and first defining what health means to you, and then what measurements, and then not falling into the trap that I only like a measurement that makes me look good, and not to go into the other. And I'll give you like a medical analogy from somebody I know who is a marathon runner, and for all personal health checks was doing really well, and then had a heart attack because he wasn't paying attention to the one thing that would have told him that was coming, right? Which is the danger of health checks when you're looking at it from this thing of, okay, I've decided what health is for this project. I start looking at what are the measurements that are going to be indicator it's good health, and do I have the right ones, and how do I continually test for that and look for the one maybe I've missed, and not be afraid of the, as you said, it's a signal that something might be going wrong, but not be afraid of looking for that signal that's going to tell me something's really wrong. Again, it's too easy to be a little bit look at what makes us look good within that.
But the point is, though, to identify when things are going wrong, that's more important. I mean, sort of everybody, I think, intuitively kind of knows what good or right feels like, but it's when we start to drift away from that, how do we understand what's causing us to drift away from that? Because, like, for me, I can feel that, hey, maybe the flow is slowing down, or there's these, like, say, for example, there's a lot more work in progress than there used to be. Things are getting more complicated. But what are, how to put an objective definition of what are the things that are causing the change in the wrong direction? It's more important, I think, to identify when things are going wrong than when things are going right.
I think both things are true. Like, I really like the example, Michael, of the heart attack, because I think everybody here has encountered the heart attack state where all of a sudden you're like onboarding a new partner, or a new integration or feature comes down from leadership somewhere, or a new customer dictates that something you weren't paying attention to is now a massive issue that grinds everything to a halt. The equivalent of the heart attack, or the heart attack could be somebody leaves your organization, right? And without a sufficiently broad health check, and this is the argument for the broad and extensive health check that isn't focused on what is the measure that we care about the most, or what are the 2 to 4 metrics we care about the most. So I think, that back to the medical analogy, the full body physical, the periodic full body physical has a purpose, right? It's not I've got this ache in my shoulder. It's what is the thing that you're totally unaware of that might be creeping up on you that could cause problems.
So
that's not a health check, right? So just to be clear, like the annual full body physical is a completely different diagnostic than the, every 90 days go to the doctor, have your, blood pressure and all that sort of looked at. So
right.
Fair enough.
So here's the part that I've discovered is valuable, is that what Steve is describing as a full body physical is how how Spotify had seen the health checks, that it's a thing where you pull back. It's not a day-to-day thing. It's not a quick temperature check and move on. That's what like regular retros are for. That's what the regular team short loop cadences are for. The health check is all about what at the root of it is, what do you believe an organization should be? And are you there in all those facets of how an organization should be? Are you achieving mission and vision rollout down to the teams? Do the teams understand the mission and vision of the organization? How are you to know that if you don't ask them? Are the teams working well in amongst themselves, in amongst other teams, across divisions? All those sorts of big picture, high level things that don't come up in regular conversation have to have a forum. And that is how I've seen success with it, is if you give them the opportunity to talk about value. Are you delivering value as a team? Do you talk about that, or do you just assume that you are? And then when the product tanks, you're all like, oh no, what happened? So having the understanding that the facilitator going through these health checks has to have a real good tie to what leadership believes the organization should look like, because they're the one who's coming and saying, here's all the ideals and here's all the, value. Well, this is what value is. Do you feel you're achieving that? That, like, what I've discovered is that's like super dangerous, because if you don't have the ability to communicate that on the same levels, well, you get all, anyways, I'll let Steve go on.
I think that this has led me into a part of this discussion that we've sort of neglected. We've been focusing on the team, but a lot of organizations use health checks to sort of look at teams at a higher level, right? And sort of look at benchmarks or baselines across teams and say which teams might need some more support, which teams might be excelling that we can learn from, right? And having a standard measure allows teams to be compared to a degree, which of course has, pitfalls and risks, but opportunities. So what does everybody think about that in the last couple of minutes?
I think you have to really be careful when you do that, because teams are different. As we started the conversation, their maturity, their focus, their skills, all those things vary. The people are varying. It's kind of like standardized school tests. Like, what are you actually measuring when you measure students and their achievement on a test? Because the grade last year is completely different from the grade this year, and yet somehow that grade 3 or whatever is being measured, is supposed to be reflective of the school and the teachers and so on. So I think you have to be very careful about that. And I forget what's the rule when the metric becomes the measure. What's that sort of law? I forget what it's called. But
when the measure becomes a target.
When the measure becomes a target, yes, thank you. I think you run the risk of missing all the nuance and then focusing on, oh, look, team B is lagging team A. Well, team B must have problems. Well, no, maybe the measure itself isn't, the right measure.
Yeah, and I don't think they are exclusive. We talked about focusing on an area that the team struggle with, and also using overall general criteria. And I don't think it's exclusive, right? I think it's interesting to identify areas that we want to improve, overall areas, but also have a combination between what we do in retrospective and what we do during this health check. Because when we identify a problem, we don't want to table it for the next 3-month health check, but we want to incorporate it in the health check, right? So it has to be flexible enough that it's owned by the team, and it has to be flexible enough that they can add aspects, areas that they believe they're not doing well with. So for me, it's a combination between overall team's criteria, but also very tactical and specific areas that they're struggling with at the moment, and that can be identified during a retrospective. And I don't think that retrospectives are often well addressed, right? We identify impediments, and I see you smile, Chris, but it's true, right? We're really good at identifying a lot of impediments, logging them in the improvement backlog, but we hardly work on it. And so I've seen that moving those into the health check really helps, because we look at it in a really different fashion. It's more visible, more transparent. And so it has to be flexible.
Anybody have any last thoughts? This time has flown.
I throw out one other point of that a big, and this is kind of theory of management-y stuff, but shared understanding is one of the biggest things that comes out of this, is that you get to make visible things that are normally invisible. And when things are visible, then you can actually do something about it. So it's another nice side of it.
Yeah, I think that for me, that it brings back that idea of treading lightly and being very careful with that. But I think under the following or under the right circumstances, you can lay the groundwork for productive conversations. But we are at time. This has been fantastic. Excellent work, everybody, for a second round, and we will we'll carry some. I've got ideas for the next session. We should probably nominate an official host for next time, so I don't monopolize that job. But thanks everybody for joining. This was fantastic. I hope you all enjoyed it. I did.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.